Okay, the ATU pond experiment. So, habitat can play a major role in species richness. Communities within the pond and creek use different habitats for different things, such as finding food, spawning, and sunning. Depending on the species and the time of year, depends on which of these they're doing at that time. Um, this paper found that these are the most common things they're doing. Uh, Ponds generally have a higher diversity of richness than creeks or rivers. This is in part of stocking. You're stocking in one given area versus in a river where it spreads out for miles. In local farm ponds, this is caused generally by stocking of species. Um, it's not necessarily even the species they meant to bring in, but it also could be species that aren't caught when they're sorting through the fish to stock. This is common with shad and the gizzard shad that were in that pond. It's very well it could have been something like that. So our hypothesis. We hypothesized that the fyke net would catch a higher species richness than the minnow traps. Additionally, we hypothesized that it would catch higher species richness within the pond versus within the creek. So on the left we have the fyke net, and on the right we have the minnow trap. And then in this map, this is where we set up our area for both traps and fyke nets. They were all in that general area. So, yeah.
When discussing methods for our pond experiment, we must discuss the gear types used during this experiment. We utilized two different types of gear, fyke nets and minnow traps. The minnow trap is shown on the image on the left, placed inside the creek tributary, and the fyke net is shown in the image on the right, placed inside the pond. In order to get a better understanding of how these types of gear work, we decided to use two minnow traps and two fyke nets. For the minnow trap, we placed one in the pond while the other was placed into the creek flowing into the pond. For bait, we used wet cat food in Ziploc bags, which we poked holes in to allow the scent to spread. For the fyke nets, we decided to place both nets in the same section of the pond. In order to gather two different data sets, we placed the mouth of one net facing the bank, while the mouth of the other was facing towards the pond. Like the minnow traps, the fyke nets were also baited with wet cat food in Ziploc baggies, which we poked holes in to allow the scent to spread.
For our results, we found that fyke nets captured higher species richness. We also found that traps targeting the creek had a higher species richness than their counterparts targeting the pond. Also, one of the minnow traps did not capture any fish. We also found that fyke nets had much higher catch per unit efforts. In this figure here, it just kind of visualizes what we found which with the catch per unit effort. You can see clearly that the fyke nets had a much higher catch per unit effort than the minnow traps, with the one minnow trap in the pond not catching anything. And we'll talk a little bit more about why in the discussion. But it's our catch per unit for fyke nets toward the creek was about 13, while our catch per unit for fyke net toward the pond is about 4, and the minnow trap in the creek catch per unit effort was less than 1. This figure just shows our species richness per trap type. As you can see, the fyke net facing toward the creek obviously had the highest species richness with 7. The fyke net toward the pond had the second highest with 2. And then the minnow trap in the creek had 1. And minnow trap in the pond had 0, obviously, without catching any fish. So this just once again shows that fyke nets were a lot better at capturing fish.
In conclusion, our hypothesis that fyke nets would capture higher species richness than minnow traps was supported by our data. Fyke nets are much larger than minnow traps, and this could result in a higher catch per unit effort by allowing more fish to be captured than the minnow traps in the same amount of time. Minnow traps also have a smaller mesh size, which could capture species that would be able to escape a pike net. Also, pike nets have a larger opening than minnow traps, making it more likely that fish will be able to enter. Our additional hypothesis that ponds would have a higher species richness than the creek was not supported by our data. We hypothesized that the pond would have more richness due to being stocked. We suggested that because the creek entrance is shallow, many fish would not be able to escape from the pond to the creek. Another reason we made this hypothesis is because in the winter, fish tend to move to deeper water because it provides more optimal environmental conditions. The best explanation we could suggest for our findings is that the creek is more suitable at this time of the year than the pond. In addition, the mouth of the creek could provide greater food source for small fish than the pond itself.